On the 2nd of October, 1187, a Muslim army entered Jerusalem, and the city's residents braced for the same massacre that had happened there 90 years earlier. It never came. Instead, the conqueror, a Kurdish general named Saladin, let most of the population ransom themselves and walk away alive. That single choice turned a military victory into one of the most famous moments in medieval history, remembered by both Muslim and Christian writers for centuries. But to understand why Jerusalem fell so fast in 1187, we have to go back 3 months earlier, to a battlefield that decided everything before the siege even began. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how Saladin's army broke the Crusader kingdom, and why what he did next surprised everyone watching. Let's start with the man himself and the political puzzle he had to solve before Jerusalem was even in reach. For decades before 1187, the Levant was a patchwork of rival Muslim territories, and that fragmentation was the main reason the Crusader kingdoms had survived as long as they had. Saladin, born into a Kurdish family, rose through the politics of the Zengid world and then built the Ayyubid state, gradually unifying Egypt and much of Syria under his own authority. That unification mattered more than any single battle he ever fought, because a divided enemy is what had kept Jerusalem in Crusader hands for nearly 90 years. Saladin's real achievement wasn't just military genius. It was patiently reducing that political fragmentation until one unified force could finally challenge the kingdom directly. Once that unification was in place, everything else in this story became possible, and the countdown to Jerusalem's fall genuinely began. It helps to remember how the Crusader states first got there in the first place. The First Crusade captured Jerusalem back in 1099, creating Latin Christian states across the eastern Mediterranean. For nearly 90 years, those states survived largely because their Muslim neighbors were divided against each other rather than united against a common enemy. Every time a Crusader kingdom faced a single, fractured rival instead of a unified front, it bought itself more time to entrench, build fortifications, and settle the land. Saladin's political project quietly removed that advantage piece by piece, and by the 1180s, the balance of power had shifted more than most people in Jerusalem realized. The road to Jerusalem ran directly through a single catastrophic battle that most people have never fully heard the details of. On the 4th of July, 1187, Saladin decisively defeated the field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at a place called Hattin. The defeat was devastating on every level. Many of the kingdom's leading nobles were killed or captured, and the True Cross, one of Christendom's most sacred relics, was seized. Losing the True Cross wasn't just symbolic damage, it represented the collapse of the kingdom's spiritual confidence at the exact same moment its army physically ceased to exist. With its field army gone, the kingdom lost the only real tool it had to defend its inland cities from what came next. After Hattin, Saladin moved with startling speed, rapidly capturing town after town across the region while barely slowing down. Jerusalem was no longer protected by any viable relief force, and several factors made the city vulnerable almost overnight. The Crusader field army had already been broken at Hattin, key leaders were dead, captured, or scattered, and the kingdom was politically strained even before the campaign began. Saladin could now concentrate on individual cities one at a time instead of fearing a major field army striking at his rear during a siege. Jerusalem carried immense symbolic value, but strategically it was never ideally placed to resist indefinitely without support from the wider kingdom around it. Consider how differently this campaign might have gone if the kingdom's army had survived Hattin even partially intact, with enough soldiers left to reinforce a single besieged city. Instead, Saladin faced almost no organized military resistance as he moved from town to town, which is exactly why the campaign moved with such unusual speed. Historians often point to this rapid post-Hattin sweep as proof that the battle itself, not the siege of Jerusalem, was the true turning point of the entire war. By the time Saladin's forces reached Jerusalem's walls, the outcome was already heavily decided. The only real question left was how the ending would actually unfold. This is where one of the most compelling human stories in the entire siege enters, a nobleman named Balian of Ibelin. After the disaster at Hattin, Balian asked Saladin for permission to enter Jerusalem for a very personal reason, to retrieve his wife Maria Comnene and their family. According to widely repeated accounts, Saladin granted safe passage on one condition, that Balian would not take up arms and would remain in the city only briefly. But once inside, Balian found Jerusalem desperate and effectively leaderless, and the residents and clergy pressed him hard to stay and organize its defense. He then informed Saladin that he could not keep his earlier promise, because the situation inside the city had changed far more radically than either man expected. Saladin reportedly responded with practicality rather than immediate retaliation, which tells you something important about how he approached this entire campaign. Balian's story has been romanticized in later retellings, but the core fact remains. He became the principal lay leader defending Jerusalem during its final days as a Crusader city. Picture the position Balian was actually in. A nobleman who entered the city for a personal family reason and ended up leading its entire military defense within days. He had given his word to Saladin under one set of circumstances, and then found himself breaking that word under a completely different, far more desperate set of circumstances. That tension between a personal promise and an urgent public responsibility is exactly what makes his role in this story so compelling almost 900 years later. Saladin's measured response to that broken promise also tells us something important. He was already thinking beyond simple military victory toward how this campaign would be remembered. Now let's walk through the siege itself, because the timeline reveals just how desperate this defense really was. Most sources date the siege from the 20th of September to the 2nd of October, 1187, though some traditions differ slightly on the exact day count. Saladin's forces first attacked sectors of the wall carrying deep symbolic and practical importance, sections tied directly to the original Crusader conquest back in 1099. The defenders resisted more effectively than Saladin may have expected, and his initial assault did not succeed the way his earlier victories had. So Saladin shifted his pressure to a completely different stretch of wall, bringing in siege engines and sustaining a relentless, coordinated attack there instead. Balian's defenders fought with genuine courage, but they were badly outmatched in manpower, equipment, and overall strategic position against Saladin's forces. The city's defenders weren't only trained soldiers either, they included a shaken civilian population, clergy, and hastily improvised recruits with little real combat experience. Contemporary accounts describe intense emotional and religious tension inside the walls, fear of massacre, memory of the bloody 1099 conquest, and the grim awareness that no rescue army was coming. That combination of fear and desperation set the stage for one of the most consequential negotiations in medieval history. Every person inside those walls had grown up hearing stories about what happened the last time this city changed hands by force, back in 1099. That earlier conquest was remembered as a bloodbath, and its memory hung over every single decision Jerusalem's defenders and residents made during these final weeks. So when Saladin's forces finally breached the outer defenses in a decisive way, the fear inside the city wasn't abstract history. It was a very immediate, personal terror. Understanding that fear is essential to understanding why the negotiation that followed felt so remarkable to everyone who lived through it. Here's why this event became so famous, because it did not end the way everyone inside the city expected it to. During negotiations, Balian is said to have warned that if the city were stormed without agreed terms, defenders might destroy holy sites and kill Muslim prisoners rather than surrender quietly. Whether every detail of that threat was entirely practical or partly rhetorical, it gave Saladin real incentive to accept negotiated terms instead of forcing a bloody final assault. Saladin wanted Jerusalem, but he also wanted the city intact, politically useful, and religiously sanctified once it came fully under his rule. On the 2nd of October, 1187, the city surrendered by formal agreement rather than falling through slaughter. The terms required ransoms for release, 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, and a smaller sum for a child, figures repeated across multiple historical sources. A remarkable additional term allowed 7,000 poorer inhabitants to be freed together for a single lump sum payment of 30,000. Not everyone could actually afford to pay, and some inhabitants who couldn't were enslaved, a detail that honest history should never quietly erase from the story. Yet, compared with the mass slaughter associated with the original Crusader capture of Jerusalem in 1099, Saladin's entry was markedly, dramatically more restrained. It's worth sitting with that contrast for a moment. One conquest of this same city is remembered for streets running with blood, and the other for organized, if imperfect, mercy. That contrast is precisely why Saladin's name still carries such weight across both Muslim and later European historical memory nearly 9 centuries afterward. None of this erases the hardship of those who couldn't afford ransom, but it does explain why chroniclers on multiple sides described this surrender as something genuinely unusual for its time. Medieval sieges routinely ended in slaughter when cities resisted, so a negotiated surrender of this scale, for a city this symbolically important, stood out immediately to contemporaries. What Saladin did after the surrender is central to why his reputation grew as large as it did across both Muslim and Christian worlds. He allowed many inhabitants to ransom themselves and depart safely, and some vulnerable captives were released through mercy or through payment arranged by others on their behalf. His own brother, Aladil, is often credited in the sources with requesting and securing freedom for a number of these captives personally. Saladin also permitted native Eastern Christians to remain in the city, and he is generally understood to have allowed Jews to resettle there after decades of Crusader rule. The Christian holy places were not destroyed. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was reportedly closed briefly while its status was decided, but pilgrimage was later permitted under specific conditions. Muslim holy sites, above all the Haram al-Sharif complex, were ritually restored and brought back into Islamic religious life after decades under Crusader control. So why did this single event matter so enormously far beyond the walls of one city? Symbolically, Jerusalem was the prize above every other prize, and its loss shocked Latin Christendom far beyond the actual military value of any single fortress. Strategically, the fall confirmed that Hattin had permanently broken the kingdom's core defensive capacity, not just delayed it. Politically, Saladin's prestige soared across the entire Islamic world, and he became known as the ruler who had recovered Jerusalem itself. Religiously, the event was framed in providential, sacred terms by writers on both sides of the conflict. Internationally, the fall of Jerusalem directly helped trigger the Third Crusade, drawing in major figures like Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa. Three of medieval Europe's most powerful rulers mobilizing armies over the loss of a single city shows exactly how much weight Jerusalem carried in the European imagination. None of them had a direct territorial claim to defend there, yet the symbolic pull of recovering the city was strong enough to launch one of the largest military campaigns of the era. That single fact alone tells you Jerusalem's fall in 1187 wasn't just a regional setback, it was a shock felt across the entire continent. But it's important to be clear about what this event did not mean for the wider region. It did not mean Crusader power vanished overnight. Tyre resisted successfully, and the center of the Kingdom of Jerusalem later shifted to coastal cities, especially Acre. It also did not make Saladin's rule permanently unchallengeable. The Third Crusade went on to recover significant coastal territory, even though it ultimately failed to retake Jerusalem itself. And it wasn't a bloodless fairy tale either. The surrender was more restrained than 1099. But it still involved real war trauma, ransoming pressure, captivity, and enslavement for those who couldn't pay. It's worth remembering that thousands of families were displaced within days, forced to gather whatever coin or valuables they had left just to buy their own freedom. Some accounts describe long lines of refugees leaving the city on foot, watched by soldiers on both sides, a scene far removed from the clean, heroic narrative often told later. Honest history holds both of these truths together. The surrender really was a mercy compared to what came before it, and it was still a deeply painful, disruptive event for the people living through it. Saladin's reputation deserves one final layer of nuance before we close this out. Muslim chroniclers celebrated him as the restorer of Jerusalem and a champion of jihad, cementing his legendary status across the Islamic world for centuries afterward. Later European writers, especially when comparing him to more brutal or treacherous figures from Crusader memory, sometimes cast him as the noble Muslim adversary in their own retellings. Both images contain real truth, but both also involve some smoothing. Saladin could be genuinely magnanimous, but he was also a practical conqueror carefully building legitimacy through staged piety and calculated mercy. Later medieval European literature even folded Saladin into chivalric romance, occasionally portraying him almost as an honorary knight, despite the fact he never converted or fought under Christian banners. That kind of cross-cultural respect for a wartime opponent was rare in medieval writing, and it says as much about the power of the Jerusalem story as it does about Saladin personally. Modern historians try to hold both threads at once, respecting his real strategic mercy while resisting the urge to flatten a complicated political figure into a simple legend. Let's run through the full chronology one final time to lock this timeline firmly in place. On the 4th of July, 1187, Saladin defeats the Crusader field army at Hattin, breaking the kingdom's military core in a single afternoon. Through July and September, Ayyubid forces rapidly seize most of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's remaining territory, city by city, almost unopposed. On the 20th of September, the siege of Jerusalem formally begins under the standard chronology followed by most historians. In late September, initial assaults are resisted, forcing Saladin to shift his attack sectors and intensify pressure elsewhere along the walls. On the 2nd of October, 1187, Jerusalem surrenders to Saladin under negotiated terms, ending nearly 9 decades of Crusader rule over the city. From late 1187 onward, news of the loss reverberates across Europe, directly contributing to the launch of the Third Crusade. So here's the final synthesis of everything we've covered today. The capture of Jerusalem was the defining political and symbolic payoff of Saladin's entire 1187 campaign, made possible by the collapse at Hattin 3 months earlier. Saladin's desperate, improvised defense made the siege dramatic, and Saladin's negotiated surrender made the outcome historically distinctive rather than another repeat of past bloodshed. The event ended nearly 9 decades of Crusader Jerusalem, restored the city to Muslim rule, elevated Saladin into legend, and directly set the stage for the Third Crusade that followed. Its lasting power lies in that rare combination: military collapse, sacred geography, political theater, and the sharp contrast between an expected massacre and an actual negotiated peace. 900 years later, historians, filmmakers, and writers still return to this single autumn in 1187 because so few historical moments combine all of those elements at once. A broken kingdom, a desperate improvised defense, a conqueror choosing restraint over vengeance, and a peace treaty that still shapes how 3 major religions remember this one city today. There's another side of this story we haven't covered yet. What happened during the Third Crusade when Richard the Lionheart finally faced Saladin directly on the battlefield? That confrontation produced one of the most famous rivalries in medieval history, and it's a story just as dramatic as the fall of Jerusalem itself. Watch the next video on this channel to see exactly how that legendary rivalry between Saladin and Richard the Lionheart actually unfolded.